I wish each of you had the opportunity to stand up here and receive such a blessing. It's truly beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joel. And now, Father, we give you thanks for this blessed and holy place. We thank you that you've called us here to share the bread of life with you and with one another. And so we again say, take our thoughts, take our listening hearts, and speak to them. Speak through these lips and this mind, I pray, that your name will be glorified. Amen. This morning, I continue and go back to the early part of John. You'll soon discover that John is my favorite of all the gospel writers. And I think that all of us, as we come into a greater awareness of who Jesus is attracted to John in a way that none of the others speak so clearly to us, because John deals with the inner nature, that part that contains the Spirit of God. And this morning, I want us to think about life with this beautiful banner so before us. Really just simply speaks to us of life and the life that the heart of God gives to the world. So I would like us to think about life as John describes it. And I feel sure you're acquainted with the fact that John begins his gospel talking about life. He concludes it by talking about life, and he talks about life all through it. But I would like to read to you the prologue, the letter of John. The Gospel of John, excuse me. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I'm skipping down to the 14th verse. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. And from him, his fullness have we all received, grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, he has made him known. Then in the 20th chapter, at the conclusion of the 20th chapter, we read these words. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And then we know that tucked away in the 10th chapter of John, we have the words, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. Last night, Taffy referred to our bond of faith, which is the bond that we as people in CFO, if you agree to it, live by and conduct CFO by, knowing that we are not a church, knowing that certain doctrine is not required, but knowing that we take our source and center the leadership of Jesus Christ. And also we accept as our law of conduct and the source of our energy the two great commandments that he gave, upon which rest all the law and the prophets. The deepest passion of our lives is to learn how to love God with all the strength of our dedicated bodies, all the intelligence of our dedicated minds, all the loyalty of our dedicated hearts, and all the devotion of our dedicated souls. We shall try to practice, and by the contagion of our example, inspire others to practice, loving our neighbors as ourselves, regardless of nationality, race, or creed. Our constitution of conduct shall be woven out of the Sermon on the Mount. Through adherence to this constitution, we shall hope to make religion go beyond science and become an art, lifting it above the law into grace and from a code into a contagion. I have a great yearning in my heart that all of us who are part of CFO will become so contagious with the love of God. This is one of the heaviest things I ever wore around my neck. A weight. The Lord is weighing me down for some reason or other. But it's essential part of the equipment that goes with today's life. So, in thinking about CFO and all that it means, and thinking about people that have influenced our lives as we've gone to CFO, as well as other places, of course, because CFO doesn't have a monopoly, although some of us are inclined to believe it does. We're so grateful for it. But I've heard others say, and I've thought many times, what really did Frank Laubach do for me? Because, you know, I can't give you my faith. I can't give you my love of Jesus. Nor could Frank Laubach give that to me. But he did this for me. He created a hunger. And so that contagiousness that Glenn Clark wrote about is something that we want, and that's a part of the life that comes forth through us. Not our life, but his life coming through us. And so today, as we think about life, this life of the kingdom, this inner life that is life, the spirit that goes on forever. Because as we begin to adjust our thinking to living in two worlds at once, a world of time, a world of space, and yet living beyond time and beyond space. Because as we grow in prayer and as we grow in awareness of his presence within us, then we realize that we do live in two kingdoms simultaneously. As we begin to orient ourselves to a brand new world, this world of the Spirit, this invisible world, yet the real world, we have to practice over and over and over again. And I'm so thankful Frank Laubach gave me his little game with minutes. Some of the copies are on the book table. Trying to take 1 second out of every moment to think of God. Try that sometime, because you realize, if you're like me, that hours would go by and I would not give him a thought. I would not be aware of his presence. But this little game with minutes that Laubach had just helps to reorient ourselves, because we're so much a part of the world. And we'll always be a part of the world and should be a part of the world. But at the same time, we are learning not to have to alternate our worlds, but to live in two worlds simultaneously. And so as I think about life, the life that Jesus came to tell us about, I remember that there are three primary movements. There are three great movements in the growth of a soul. A person who goes beyond just physical thinking, just living in this world, to living in the dimension of God and the kingdom of earth. of heaven on earth within me. And the first and absolutely necessary movement in the growth of a soul is an utterly unconditional, joyful self-giving to God. I remember a small book that I read a few years ago. It was 6 20th century mystics. And I was happy that Frank Laubach and Glenn Clark were 2 of those 6. Not that they were excluding many others, but this was just written little biographical sketches of these 6 men. With those was Peter Marshall, Rufus Jones, the great Quaker, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the martyr, and Albert Schweitzer, the man who gave up so much that he had to give of natural to do the supernatural work he did in Africa. And as I read those biographies, I thought, what do they have in common? Because each of them was so different. Their ministries were so different. The way God used them in different places around the world. Their influence was great, all of them. But their ministries were different. And I tried to find out what did they have in common. And I recognized that they had certain things in common, and that was, first, that they centered their lives in Jesus Christ, that he was the center, their source of life. They had learned what is said in this bond of faith, that we take as our source and center Jesus Christ. They lived with great appreciation for the Scriptures, immersing themselves in the Scriptures daily. They were men of prayer. They were spoken of as men who know God. Because, as you and I have had to learn, there's so much difference in knowing about God. I was a Sunday school teacher and a superintendent of Sunday school department for years. And I didn't know God. I knew about him. I knew the words sufficiently to teach. But tragically, I didn't know him. And so there's a vast difference. But these were men who knew God. And they were men who were in continuous surrender, continuous self-giving to God. That great surrender of ourselves, giving up the right to myself. And that's what I think of as surrender. As saying, okay, I've made a mess, or maybe you haven't lived long enough to make a mess of it. But whatever brings you to the point of surrender of yourself to God. And then it's a continuous thing. I wanted to read you this poem, prayer poem by Michael Quoist. It really speaks to me from his little book of prayers. And it's thinking about surrender, this first great movement in the growth of a soul. Help me to say yes. I'm afraid of saying yes, Lord. Where will you take me? I'm afraid of drawing the longer straw. I'm afraid of signing my name to an unread agreement. I'm afraid of the yes that entails other yeses. Yet I am not at peace. You pursue me, Lord. You besiege me. Where shall I hide? I meet you everywhere. Is it then impossible to escape you? But I'm afraid of saying yes, Lord. I'm afraid of putting my hand in yours, for you hold on to it. I'm afraid of meeting your eyes, for you can win me. I'm afraid of your demands, for you are a jealous God. I'm hemmed in, yet I hide. I'm captured, yet I struggle and I fight, knowing that I'm defeated. But you're the stronger, Lord. You own the world, and you take it from me. Everything seems empty. Everything seems hollow. You've made a desert around me. I'm hungry and thirsty, and the whole world cannot satisfy me. And yet I loved you, Lord. What have I done to you? I worked for you. I gave myself for you. Oh, great and terrible God, what more do you want? Son, I want more for you and your world. Until now, you have planned your actions, but I have no need of them. You have asked for my approval. You have asked for my support. You have wanted to interest me in your work. But don't you see, son, that you're reversing roles? I've watched you. I've seen your goodwill, but I want more than you now. You will no longer do your own works, but the will of your Father who is in heaven. Say yes, son. I need your yes, as I needed Mary's yes to come to earth. For it is I who must do your work. It is I who must live in your family. It is I who must be in your neighborhood, and not you. For it is my look that penetrates, and not yours. My words that carry weight, and not yours. My life that transforms, and not yours. Give all to me. Abandon all to me. I need your yes to be united with you and to come down to earth. I need your yes to continue saving the world. Oh Lord, I'm afraid of your demands, but who can resist you? That your kingdom may come and not mine. That your will be done and not mine. Help me to say yes. And so in the movements, if you would grow into the likeness of Jesus, if you would receive the life that he came to give, then our first thing is to say yes. We know that Jesus is called the divine yes because all of the demands of God found their yes in him. And so we must come to that point. And as Michael Kors said, and we identify with, those words just cause a great resonation within us because we know that it's difficult to say yes, not knowing why we're so afraid of change, and yet knowing that yes is demanded. I've discovered that we usually meet life in three ways. We fight it, or we escape it, or we say yes. And sometimes we do all of those things. We were talking last night about how trying to escape life and build in the walls that separate us, how that keeps us from life. And we know that anger and fighting God and fighting life, because when we're fighting life, we're fighting God. We're fighting situations the way they are. We're fighting what's happening to me. We're fighting just in our spirit. We're fighting life, fighting people, because there's great violence within us until it comes under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so if we would be followers of Jesus, we must come to that point first of saying yes, and then daily drawing near to him. We will talk about abiding later, because we need to every day learn what it is to abide in him, to spend time with him daily through scriptures and prayer, that we may grow from the baby that we are when we first come into this dimension, into the person that he designed us to be, so that we too, as a yes, may be like Mary's yes to the world. I had an experience that brought that very much alive to me. As you no doubt will discover, God has been so gracious to me in that with my curious, searching mind and thinking for years that if I read enough books and thought enough and heard enough good preachers and all, I would have the answers to life. But then I discovered that the life really is an inner one, and the journey is an inner one. And so I've really asked the Lord many, many questions, and particularly questions that have eternal meaning and value. And he will always give me an experience to show me. I'm very much like Thomas in "Show me, Lord." I must see and put my hands in those nail prints. Firsthand. I want a first-hand knowledge of God. And of course, that's all we can have anyway. But I won't take secondhand what somebody else says. And don't you either. Don't be satisfied. Don't believe what you're hearing here. Go out and check yourself for yourself. But I can remember once when this particular thought became alive in my own experience. And that's where the living it begins to come. Having a radio program weekly in human relations work, I decided at Christmas time that rather than the typical interviews that I usually did, I would have a little message. And so I was sitting at my typewriter thinking about the Christmas story. And as a drama major, I thought how differently I would have programmed that. How differently the choice of characters in the story would have been. How different the location and the simplicity and humility of Mary and the peasant girl, and that out-of-the-way place, and no fanfare, only the shepherds who had learned to listen and to be still knew that the angels were singing. But I would have had large trumpeters and Edie with her band, no doubt, drum, all sorts of things to awaken all the people. But I was thinking all these thoughts as I was contemplating the Christmas story, the strange way in which the Spirit of God came upon this peasant girl, and the divine and the human met, and from that came Jesus the Christ. And even as I thought these thoughts, there came to me this clarity of call that he had chosen not only that Mary, but this Mary. And as that came into my clear realization, there wasn't just an intellectual fact, it's called each of us, but it came to me in this way. And I thought, the love that poured through me at that point was so wonderful and so enlightening. And so I looked through my open door, which was just opposite the mayor's door, and through it walked the angriest black man I've nearly ever seen. He was so full of hate. I'd never seen him before, and as I reached out my hand and asked him to sit down, he poured forth for an hour and a half all the venom that had been in him for so long. I felt as if I were listening to 200 years of anger and venom. And he first shared with me the injustice he had received and then poured forth this. And as I was listening to him, God reminded me of this tremendous love he poured through me just a moment before. And he said, I want you to give that love to that young man. And as I looked at him and began to pour forth this love, just project this love without saying a word, and his hate coming, it became a circle. And it's almost, I could see it, that this hate was coming this way and this love was being transformed and made into love. And as I looked at him, I saw him with different eyes. I saw all of this energy that was full of hate transformed into constructive, creative leadership, had tremendous potential. And as I listened to him, no longer, even though my rational mind was telling me how I would have reacted at one time in my natural being, look, I never saw you before, why are you pouring it out on me, this sort of thing. But this love, this divine love was pouring through me until at the end of that time, he stood up and thanked me, and I wished him a blessed Christmas, and I'd done nothing other than I had done everything in that he changed the way he thought about himself and the way he thought about others. At the conclusion of that, when he had left, the Lord gave me the lesson from that experience, as he always will, if we take time to live fully the experiences of life that he gives us. And he showed me so clearly that love is stronger than hate. But all the hate in the world must be swallowed up in love. And that those of us who are channels of this love are the ones he's called for that purpose. And so Michael Kors was quite right in that you never know where God's going to call you. You never know what experiences he has ahead for you to live out that which you claimed to believe intellectually. Because so many of us, and this is right, we go through the intellectual part, and then it becomes real later, if it becomes real. Because it's not intellectual assent to a person or to doctrine that makes us Christian, but it's being possessed by a certain person and participating in a certain life. And so as we think about what John said, that Jesus is the Word, he's the means of communication that God has used to show us, to clarify in our thinking what God's plan is for all of us. But as he had to say yes, Mary had to say yes before him, so you and I have to learn to say yes. And it's a total yes, as much as we're capable of giving at the time, as much of ourselves as we know, to as much of him as we know. But see, it keeps growing. Unfortunately, some people stop there and never grow into maturity. But that daily living with him and then being used as an instrument of God. As we think about life, I always think about that particular quote of St. Irenaeus that's so popular and been used a lot. But I discovered it years ago, and it really speaks to me. And that is that the glory of God is man fully alive. And the life of such a man consists in beholding God. You and I want to be fully alive. Fully alive as Jesus was. And as I think about how would you describe a person fully alive. Certain things come to my mind. The first is a person who has answered the 4 ultimate questions of life. Those questions each one of us has to answer in our own ways. Who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from and where am I going? And the only person that's ever lived those completely is Jesus Christ. And as I think about him, fully alive, he who had such trust in the Father that he could say, that he had no worries, that his burden was light, when we so heavily carry burdens around with us. But he had learned the secret of life, and that was to be totally yielded to the Father, to be totally dependent on the Father, to be radically obedient to the Father. And so I want you to ask yourself, how do you really meet life? Do you really have a negative, fighting spirit within you? I know that I've had to recognize that within myself so often. People say things and I don't agree with, and there instantly rises up some defense. I took debating and was on the debating team in high school and college and loved it. And I've been debating with God ever since. But he is gradually teaching me, and he wins all the rebuttals. But we must, each in our own way, see, all of us are so eager to have somebody tell us that's like this, and then we know it in our heads. I have a young friend who is one of my spiritual children, I call, and she's always asking me, well, what about this? And I said, you've got to discover that for yourself. I remember Frank Armstead, another Frank in my life, was one of my spiritual directors from a distance for a long, long time. Such a beautiful person. And I can remember the first time I wrote him a very needed question. I had to have the answers immediately. And when he wrote back, the answer is in the question, I thought, hadn't told me a thing. Of course, I've learned to realize that that is true. So questioning is good. Don't be satisfied with where you are, but always be recognizing that there is more, and that we go from one degree of glory to another. And that which has caused a great deal of inner turmoil, once it's settled, then you may go along for a while, and then there's another mountain to climb in this spiritual journey. Because, see, no matter how much we know, no matter how long we've walked this way, God beckons us to more. And as I think about the life and how to live it, no longer fighting it, no longer trying to escape it. I see so many people dealing with sorrow by trying to escape it. Just last week, I was with a woman who had spent the last year going from place to place, not CFO, but place to place. She's left a wealthy widow, and so she thought she could run ahead of this which was in her, which will have to be dealt with whenever she gets too tired of going to these new places, having these so-called exciting trips and cruises and various things. So God is that hound of heaven pursuing us. He pursues each one of us until we say yes. And then once we say yes, then he brings to us day by day, year by year, these opportunities, challenges for further growth. Those things that we once called problems, and we change our language and realize they are opportunities and challenges. We change our whole vocabulary, and we change our way of looking at life, and we see people and things in a different dimension because he gradually brings to us new sight and new way of dealing with things. Because, see, God desires to come through us and pray through us and minister through us in his power, his tremendous power, not in our limitations. And those of us who've worked so earnestly, so faithfully in our churches and thought about working for God have to, like Michael Korst in this, learn that that's reversing the roles, that that's not what he wants at all. He wants us to be receivers. He wants to do the work. It's his work, not ours. It's his results, not ours. And this is an area that many of us want to see results. Let me share an experience with you. During these years of working in human relations, and as I told Becky last night, a social worker or anyone working in the area of human need and social endeavors will become totally disillusioned if you're working out of your own strength, your own human strength, and not out of God's, because it's a discouraging thing. But I can remember once when I was very, very discouraged, when I was failing miserably at doing the job God had placed me there to reconcile blacks and whites. Schools were closing, and there were policemen in the hallways of the schools. And someone suggested that I go with her for a weekend to an ashram, East Stanley Jones Christian ashrams. And I'd been before, and it just seemed right, and so I went because I wanted to speak to East Stanley Jones. And so I had 15 minutes with him. And I told him about my discouragement and that I recognized that I didn't like to fail. And I was failing miserably. And I told him the situation and told him that God had really placed me there. I knew by the various ways I check out guidance. And he listened to my story and listened to the disappointment that I had and sense of failure that I was going through. And he said, listen to me, Mary Virginia. When you start with Jesus Christ, you work from victory, not toward victory. Listen to that. They were wise words he gave me. When you start with Jesus Christ, and that means he called you to the situation and you are working at his beckoning. You work from victory, not toward victory. That next morning, Monday morning, when I went back to work, and the same things existed as had on Friday when I left. The same anger, the same hostility, the same hatred, all of this awfulness of separation and that which man does to man. And nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. Because I'd changed. My way of looking at it, working from victory rather than toward results. And as I thought about the change, I realized that, okay, Lord, I'll stay here the rest of my life if this is where you want me. Because I'd rather fail in that which will ultimately succeed than to succeed in that which will ultimately fail. So we are called to life. We don't have to worry about the results. We just concern ourselves about saying yes and then learning to be obedient. Father, we give you thanks for Jesus Christ and his radical obedience to you. We give you thanks that in him we see the perfect integration of divine and human that you intend for all of us, because he not only manifests you, but he manifests man as you designed him to be. And so, Lord, we just thank you for him. We would ponder him, the gift of his life, the gift of his love, the gift of his Spirit, that he is willed to us, and that as we say yes to him, that same divine Spirit, that same divine energy that raised him from the dead will come and live within us and do your work through us. Amazing, Lord, the vessels you choose, but it is your choice. So help each one of us, Lord, to say yes, even as Jesus said yes. Amen.